months looking at the potential role of the IMF in supporting South Africa's just transition with the support of Oxfam South Africa. I believe that many of those signing in today would be familiar with the South African Institute of International Affairs, but just briefly, we're a South African-based think tank engaged on policy research and dialogue activities, not only within South Africa, but certainly across the broader Africa region, and then of course in a range of global debates, particularly as they then relate to Africa's policy agenda. And the work that we're going to be discussing today has been undertaken, as I said, over the past few months, exploring this question and really taking as the starting point the IMF's own pronouncements that they see climate change increasingly as a macro critical issue that is highly relevant to their core mandate, and exploring how this can be integrated into their work. We took that as our starting point and said, well, how might this look in the context of South Africa's just transition debates? And it was a highly inclusive process. We had a series of workshops last year where we brought in views not only about essentially around the framing of the questions themselves, and then opportunities for further engagement in the questions. I'm going to keep my remarks very brief. I want to take you very shortly through the program. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Marianne Bonaventura Goldman from Oxfam South Africa, and then we'll have remarks by Max Allier, who's the resident representative from the IMF, and then a short presentation by the report authors, Olivia Rumble from Climate Legal, close associate of SAIS, and SAIS Executive Director Elizabeth Sideropoulos. We're then going to have a panel discussion. It's going to be moderated by Professor Danny Bradlow from the Centre of Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. Panel members are Leanne Govinsamy, Program Head for Corporate Accountability and Transparency at the Centre for Environmental Rights, Sargon Nissan, IMF Manager at Recourse, and Michael Sachs at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University. We'll then open for Q&A, and we'll have closing remarks from Nadia Dar from Oxfam International. So with that being said, I'm going to hand over now to Marianne.
Marianne, you're muted.
Sorry, I thought I had clicked the button. Thank you, Elizabeth, before I ended it all. But yes, thank you to Elizabeth, SAIA team, our partners in this initiative, and welcome to everybody for our report launch. I'd also like to thank our co-author of the report, Olivia Rumble of Climate Legal, and also to Prof. Danny Bradlow for facilitating, to Max Allier, the Res Rep of the IMF South Africa office, and our three panelists joining us, and of course to all of our participants. So I just wanted to give a little bit of context beyond what Alex had spoken about in terms of why this study, and in particular the role of the IMF and in relation to their new mandate, which expands their role and operations in relation to the climate change agenda. And so for the work that Oxfam South Africa does with partners on development finance, it's clear that the role of IFIs has been much more visible in the last 2 years, with borrowings from IFIs such as the IMF, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and the New Development Bank up to 105 billion South African rands, which is an estimate of $7 billion US, and mainly in the last 2 years to respond to the urgent needs related to health, social recovery, and economic recovery, social protection and economic recovery due to the COVID pandemic. And in terms of the role of the IMF, South Africa had borrowed, received a loan of $2 billion in July 2020. And 1 year later, in September 2021, South Africa also received about $4 billion from the IMF in special drawing rights. So all these funds, except for the SDRs, have been provided as direct budgetary support to the South African government without any restrictions or conditionalities, very little conditionalities in terms of how money is to be spent. And the SDRs were added to the South African foreign reserves. So that's a bit of the context in terms of the IFI landscape. And Oxfam and partners are also very engaged in the new development bank, which since it's opened its African Regional Center has loaned South Africa more than $4 billion. And therefore, in terms of the context, the IMF being a major player in terms of development finance to South Africa, this paper we hope will help broaden the understanding. I think what we've learned through our engagements with civil society broadly and with communities, there isn't much understanding of the role of the IMF. And I think the paper will actually show quite a bit of concerns, especially from a historical perspective, regarding the role of the IMF. And therefore, we believe that this paper will help in terms of sharing knowledge related to the IMF's mandate and its operations in the country, as well as the potential for multi-stakeholders to engage in the role of the IMF in South Africa. And finally, just to mention, recently during the budget speech, that South Africa, with a number of civil society organizations, with a new network called Fair Finance that was launched last week, and other networks and members have called for a closer dialogue with Treasury and government in an open letter to the finance minister, which focuses on discussing with Treasury South Africa's relationships with the IFIs. We believe that such a mechanism would be a step forward in terms of how government can work hand in hand with civil society, providing a more capable, ethical, and developmental state. And beyond working with Treasury, we hope that civil society can engage directly with IFIs themselves, such as through the Article 4 surveillance mechanism of the IFIs. So I think that as the authors present the findings, many of the recommendations will speak to this, speak to the importance of dialogue. And so therefore, we hope that this report launch will have this kind of open exchange that we're hoping in terms of this kind of platform. So thank you very much to everybody for joining. And I'm going to hand over back to Alex in terms of moving on with the program. Thanks.
Fantastic. And thank you so much for that additional context and framing. I think that's extremely useful going into the discussion. I'll move on directly now and hand over to Max Allier, resident representative for the IMF.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone in South Africa and Europe, and good morning to all of us on the other side of the world. I'm right now in Costa Rica. So anyway, very glad to be here. Thank you very much to Saya and to Oxfam for inviting me to be part of this presentation today. It is a great report. I've talked to Elizabeth and Olivia several times, and even participated in a workshop in the process. I think it's a very interesting report. It does make important contributions and help us look at how the world perceives our role and how we can help. So many of, I think it's of great value. As you can imagine, we sometimes will agree with her with some things, we may disagree with other things, but as a contribution to the dialogue and to help us focus on what is most valuable to our memberships and to, I was very pleased when I read the report. As I said, we don't always agree on everything, but I think the issue with climate change is, it's affecting everyone. It's become more clear over the last few years that this is accelerating. There's no economy will escape from this. And the scale of it is so large that it's what we end up calling macrocritical. It will have implication for the fiscal positions of countries. It will have implication for asset prices. It will have implication for trade flows, for real interest rates, for exchange rates. And these are areas that have been core to our work throughout our existence as an institution. So we consider as part of our mandate. I mean, of course, we cannot assist on everything related to climate change, but what we can assist or try to assist is in those areas related to our core mandate, which is basically coordinating the macroeconomic and financial policy response to the climate change crisis. So not that we are pretending to be the one who will change and save the world, we just want to contribute in our areas related to our mandate. Over the last few years, we will note that in the report, the climate change related issues have been making it into our work. You can see it in our flagship reports that we publish a couple of times a year, the World Economic Outlook, the Global Financial Stability Report, and the Fiscal Monitor. We have also published analytical papers on climate change related issues like the setting an international carbon price floor, fostering a green economy, and we have 3 forthcoming climate notes that will basically lay out the principle for integrating adaptation to climate change in fiscal policy. So that's part of our analytical work and how we're trying to contribute on that front. Now, in terms of the policy advice, we have been integrating it increasingly in our. Okay, let me take a step back. I mean, those of you who follow the IMF, we act in 3 big areas. One is surveillance, for which we have a policy dialogue with all our member countries once a year, and this is what is known as the Article 4. Then we have capacity development, where we provide technical assistance or training, and then we have the lending area. But surveillance is like the main function of the IMF, and that's what we produce for every country once a year, these Article 4 consultation reports. And we have increasingly included in the report the issue of mitigation, adaptation, transition, and we're getting there. I mean, it's not perfect, but it takes time to develop the skills and the knowledge, but we're working on that. We also have the Financial Stability Assessment Program, the so-called FSAP, that produces the Financial Stability Sector Assessment. We just published the one for South Africa. We also just published the last Article 4 for South Africa. And even in the FSAP, we're looking, we're already looking at the physical and transition risk through climate change assessments. This is important because we see, the climate change can have important implications for the financial system, for the banks. Now, in terms of capacity development, we have the Climate Macroeconomic Assessment Program, which is a climate diagnostic tool to help countries build resilience and integrate climate policies. We also have a tool that we've been using for many years. It's called the PIMA, the Public Investment Management Assessment, which looks at public investment in the member country that requests this assessment. Now we have created a climate module and we have integrated into it. And then we're also working areas of green PFM, public finance management, to integrate the climate perspective into the PFM practices. We have also launched a data dashboard. The report also calls for the data dashboard. It has a range of indicators to demonstrate the impact of economic activity is having on climate change. This indicator covers economic activity and climate, cross-border, financial, physical and transition risk, and government policy. Probably this can be improved, so it will be very interesting in the context of the proposals in the paper to get ideas on how this dashboard could be improved. Perhaps not for the theme for this seminar, but we'll be happy to follow up on that. And they were also in close collaboration with other international bodies that are dealing with climate change, because as I said, that we pretend to do everything. Finally, when it comes to financing, as some of you have followed, we are discussing now the creation of resilience and sustainability trust. This trust will be financed by some of the large countries pledging their part of their SDR allocations, and this lending will be different than what we have been providing, in the sense that it's very long term, is lending for 20 years with a 10-year grace period, and this is for countries that basically, are undertaking structural reforms and to address the climate change and transform their economies. The eligibility is quite broad, actually. It will poor countries and vulnerable middle-income members and small states will be eligible, and that basically 75% of our membership will be eligible to refinancing under this facility. Only for the qualification, the country will need to put together high-quality policy measures consistent with the purpose of the RST. That's the whole purpose of it, and have a concurrent non-financial financing or non-financing IMF-supported program. In terms of access, it will be up to 50% of the country's quota in the IMF, or 1 billion SDRs. That's about $1.4, $1.5 billion, whichever is smaller. And we have to put this cap because we don't have the final number yet, but most likely we're going to have initially about 50 billion SDRs available. So we want to make sure that most countries can get covered. And more importantly, like most IMF financing, the role is a catalytic role. I mean, we expect these countries that get engaged into this will also be able to get financing from other international institutions and really also from the private sector. And the private sector here is important, basically, because we know the scale of the program is so large that only public money or international money is not going to solve it. So it is absolutely essential to have in place a system through which private financing can also be directed or direction towards supporting the climate change. So these are the remarks I wanted to make. Thank you very much for inviting me again.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you. Once again, I'm going to move directly on with our program. Olivia and Elizabeth, please take us through the report.
Great, thanks, Alex. So I'm just going to kick off with some points and then hand over to Olivia. Some of them have already been covered by Marianne and Max, so I'm going to try to be quite succinct. Let's see if I manage that. So I think the first point to make is that clearly it's been now a few years coming that the IMF has begun to look at climate change as a macro-critical factor, as you said, Alex, that has impact on macroeconomics. But clearly it's been really only in the last couple of years where this has picked up steam, and in fact in 2021, the IMF published the comprehensive surveillance review on integrating climate change into Article 4. And as Max said, Article 4 is clearly the area where they are working with every single member state on an annual basis. Again, just to reiterate, the IMF's mandate is first and foremost about promoting global financial stability. It's hopefully about avoiding global financial crises. We know that has been difficult, but it tries to execute its mandates through three key instruments, and then there are also, of course, the SDRs. The first is surveillance, and what we'll do just now is put in the chat box the link to the most recent Article 4 consultation, the report that was published for South Africa literally a few days ago, The consultation happened in December last year. So that's the Article 4 consultations, as well as the FSAPs, as Max has said. Then there's the technical assistance and training, which focuses on economic issues. It's on request. In other words, the Article 4 happens every year. The technical assistance is based on requests made by governments, central banks, finance ministries, etc. Most of that technical support, in fact, is also focused on low and middle income countries. And then there is the loan dimension, loans to help countries that are facing balance of payments difficulties overcome these problems. And this is probably the most controversial and the most contested element of the IMF, certainly in the developing world and particularly in Africa. This is where the policy conditionalities come in that I think certainly when we're talking about structural adjustment programs in Africa in the 80s, 70s and 80s, didn't necessarily help to address some of their structural problems, but in fact through austerity measures and certainly reducing the size of the public sector have often created more problems. And so that's where it gets where a lot of the emphasis is often focused in many of the discussions around the IMF. And then there are the SDRs. Max has already alluded to that. He's spoken also about the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. Obviously, the idea is to put some SDRs pledged by the developed world into that. There's also the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, where again SDRs can be pledged, but there clearly South Africa is not eligible. The RSD is a new instrument, will probably be signed off, I think, at the spring meetings in April. But I don't know. I don't think. Just looking at the criteria, South Africa will be eligible. There are obviously a number of concerns around how it's been constructed, also again related to conditionalities. Of course, SDRs, when they come to countries, are non-conditional and non-debt creating resources. This is a slightly different animal. So the financing terms, the conditionalities have been raised by actors and civil society players around the world as issues of concern. Let's see what is finally on the table. And so the issue of conditionalities, I think, looms large in any discussion around the IMF. And so when we're talking about the just transition in South Africa and the role that the IMF is going to be potentially playing, certainly through its Article 4 surveillance, there is great concern about what that might mean and how that might affect discussions within the country already. The issue of the just transition has been a very important element of many civil society groupings over several years, not just now. And so the insertion now, as many would see it, of the IMF into some of these considerations and engagements with the government is particularly seen as particularly problematic. Neoliberal orthodoxies, economic prescriptions, all sort of carry a taint in South Africa and the rest of the developing world, I would say. If we just move to South Africa a little bit, and I know that Olivia will touch on this in more detail. Of course, we're among the top 20 emitters. We have high inequality, poverty, unemployment. So the transition risks are going to be significant and the costs are going to be significant. You know, if you look at some of the reports that have come out recently, the coal value chain employs about 450,000 people, automobile sector about 430. So, you know, as the external environment changes and begins to move in a different direction in terms of e-mobility, as well as where the South African government has to adopt certain policies in order to meet its NDCs and so on, we can see the really significant impact this can have on already existing structural problems. So, and in many of our discussions, you know, many actors said, well, we really don't want the IMF involved in this. But the issue that we have to tackle is that the IMF is going to be and has already begun discussing and putting out papers on these issues. I think it clearly is aware. It was good to hear from Max about the fact that, you know, it has to work with other organizations, that it has to stay in its lane. But bearing that in mind, we thought it would be very important to put some things on the table and to reiterate also some other work that has already been done more generically on the IMF moving into that area. So we've looked at both process and substance in terms of recommendations. I think critically, you know, I think what comes out very, very strongly is that the IMF will have to review, and I think this is not just about the IMF, I think all of us have to consider where the current environmental and economic and social challenges, where they put us in terms of the kind of economic and social system we live in and we construct. So the sort of neoliberal precepts about macroeconomics are not necessarily they are not the route to affecting a truly just transition, and this is a quote from one of our colleagues who reviewed the report. So it's about rethinking our development and economic models, which is a much bigger a challenge indeed. I think it's important to recognize that the IMF is beginning to engage, I think, with civil society, and certainly in our experience with this project, Max's door has been open and has been supportive. Clearly, there are a number of areas of concern or areas that still need improvement in how the IMF rolls out this expanded mandate. And there have been a number of reports that have been brought out by civil society actors that highlight that. Action Aid USA and Bretton Woods Project found, for example, that the IMF's policy advice endorsed or directly supported the expansion of fossil fuels in some of their Article 4 reports. In work done by Recourse, and I'm glad to see that Sargon has joined us, they found that the case studies they looked at did not discuss spillover transition risks, such as carbon border taxes of major trading partners and so on. So there are a number of issues. This is a highly complex sort of policy area where clearly there are significant macroeconomic risks that climate change will bring on, but it needs to be done in an open, transparent, inclusive manner. There needs to be the ability to provide oversight also from different stakeholders outside of government, and to be engaged and open with the policy advice that comes out. I'm going to leave it there. I know that Olivia will go into much more detail, and I've probably spoken more than I should have.
Never. That's not the case, Elizabeth. I'll try and be quick, Alex. I'll wrap up by in about 10 minutes. But forgive me, I'm just going to share some slides. So I won't rehearse our whole report with you. It's quite a substantial one, and Sai will put a link to the report at the end of today's session for you to go in your own time. But as Elizabeth was highlighting, we are a really interesting case study to engage with when it comes to the IMF's expanded mandate, because given our social, our economic, our debt, our environmental challenges, it means that we are, like a lot of developing countries, hyper exposed to transition risks. And I won't go into the definition too much, but there are a number of developments that will exacerbate these transition risks. So we plan to decommission about 5,200 megawatts of coal-based generation capacity. We have a net zero target by 2050. There is a extensive suite of policy and legislative actions that government intends to and has been taking over the last few years that will tighten our greenhouse gas emissions, but will in turn present some interesting transition challenges. We have significant coal exports, and a lot of the countries to which we export to have themselves imposed net zero targets, which renders us relatively exposed from a trade point of view and a balance of payments perspective. And there's obviously the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU, and some other countries have also been proposing these types of instruments, which are undoubtedly going to affect the type of industries that flourish in South Africa and our trade partners, as well as our export capacity. Not only do we have all these instruments on the table and these plans and processes, but we already have a very high carbon intensity. We have one of the most carbon intensive economies in the world. We have the world's largest single point source of CO2 emissions at our Secunda refinery, extremely high unemployment, extremely high debt, low growth, and a negative balance of trade. This filters through not just into trade, but also electricity supply. So it may exacerbate load shedding. There's risk of what we call stranded assets. So as the rest of the developed and developing world moves to a low carbon development trajectory, our assets like our coal-fired power plants or our new investments that are fossil fuel intensive may become stranded, no longer in use, or cannot be used because of legal and policy restrictions. It will exacerbate employment, communities, particularly in Mpumalanga. And I could go into quite some detail, but I'll just scan through it quickly. What made this report really interesting was that we were asked to engage with where South Africa stands from a policy point of view on the just transition. And again, we're a really interesting case study. We're unique in the sense that we've invested as a country considerable institutional and intellectual capacity into defining what does the just transition mean for us. And there's a suite of reports, going back to 2010, and national dialogues and efforts to try and articulate what South Africa envisages its just transition to be. The most recent of which is in the Presidential Climate Commission's just transition work and their attempts to define it. And whilst the recent work by the Presidential Climate Commission does point out that we have these areas of congruence, what it also demonstrates is that there are a number of issues that we as a country haven't quite settled yet. What is our level of ambition? To what extent do we really want to privatize assets? The role of different technologies, for example, gas, energy, and nuclear in a low carbon future, and these types of things that make it quite a difficult landscape to work within. And that has implications for the IMF as well. Because if we as a country are still trying to determine what our long-term just transition plan is, any advice, particularly Article 4 surveillance, would need to work in tandem with that and not undermine it. And it was quite interesting during our interviews, a couple of participants said, we are really concerned that we're doing all this work as a country and that the IMF is just going to come in and tell us what the just transition is and impose prescripts through, for example, loan conditionalities or advice and surveillance that undermine particularly the social and labor elements of that. So, for example, the current articulation by the PCC really focuses on a very encompassing notion of the just transition. So not just helping affected laborers, but also entire communities, social protection measures, income support, these type of things that don't necessarily sit well with traditional advice that the IMF has given in the past. So, we did a little bit of research around how the IMF has historically approached climate change or climate change related issues in the country. And I won't go into it in too much detail, but it tends to align with some of the findings that, for example, Bretton Woods and Action Aid have made, that historically the advice has actively encouraged, apologies, sorry, it's just a reminder, encourage policies that exacerbate high carbon lock-in. So, for example, in 2014, the IMF supported Eskom's investment project support in Medupi, saying that would help to strengthen public infrastructure and support the expansion of electricity supply. But that is changing, and as Max has pointed out, the most recent report does canvass some of climate change issues, renewable energy, Eskom, the carbon tax, that type of thing. And we anticipate that in time this may change. So I want to talk more to our recommendations. Again, we built on a lot of the reports and research that have been done by Bretton Woods, ActionAid, Oxfam around how the IMF could reconceive its mandate, or at least refine its mandate when engaging on climate change. And you don't want to have a situation where the IMF is advising on things that don't necessarily clearly fall within its mandate. So you want to avoid mission creep. One way of preventing that is having a dashboard of indicators of when to intervene and how. The IMF could ideally keep to its lane, working with other international organizations, for example, the ILO, the World Bank, as specialized institutions that can co-create content in their report that speak to each other. So, for example, recommendations by the ILO could be captured and reiterated in the IMF surveillance, and they can build on each other. So in the sense, it could play a flagging function. The principle of do no harm should also be affirmed within IMF surveillance. And there are a number of sensitive issues where this might overlap. So, for example, public wage bills, labor market reforms, the IMF's optimism bias, often when it has growth forecast in relation to, for example, coal exports, the cost of transition risks, universal delivery of social protection, how can we enhance tax progressivity while providing relief from indirect taxes to the vulnerable. There's a lot of subcomponents within these elements, but I suppose where we're pushing for is to argue that there's a need to be aware and sensitive to national approaches to these issues and to work around them. So, for example, if our just transition is arguing for wage support for laborers that need to move out of the coal sector, and the IMF tends to typically support targeted income support, advice by the IMF around public wage bills should be sensitive to those type of local determinations. Similarly, the time horizon of the IMF's advice will need to lengthen, so not just short-term and long-term, but even extremely long-term transition risks that need to be identified. We focus a lot on policies and procedures, so we encourage mandatory national level consultation on Article 4, particularly with civil society. Marianne has helpfully spoken about the Fair Finance Coalition, and as Elizabeth said, the IMF's door is already open, so it's about encouraging that dialogue and making it as inclusive as possible. IMF diagnostic tools need to integrate climate and just transition factors. Operational policies applicable to the use of all IMF resources, including SDRs, should be developed. And Danny or Smile, we supported the inclusion of an independent ombudsman. So someone that civil society could go to directly and to say, look, these operational policies that the IMF has designed are not being appropriately implemented. And the process of arriving at loan conditionalities needs to be more consultative. So we argue for a more inclusive approach with, for example, civil society, more transparent approach, whereby there can be engagement on very substantial conditions that might impact society. Lending programs should also be closely connected with economic surveillance reports. So ideally, Article 4 advice should speak to the way that loans are designed and the conditionalities attached to them. We make some comments on the RST. I'm just a bit short of time, so I won't go into them in too much detail. But we make the point that, South Africa doesn't have to go to the RST. There are a number of other options that the country could use to finance the just transition. So ideally, you'd want an instrument that is relatively flexible, that's not too prescriptive, and that is possibly even supportive of unorthodox and experimental forms of finance, because just transition projects, particularly the social and labor elements of them, struggle to find funding. And potentially the RST could be a very catalytic and unique instrument that does encourage this type of finance. We also highlight, I won't canvass them in too much detail, some specific issues in South Africa that the IMF may want to, in the longer term, engage with. We got a lot of feedback from stakeholders that perhaps this didn't fall nicely well within the IMF's mandate, but given the overall trajectory of where the IMF's expanded mandate is going, we argue that undoubtedly the IMF will be dealing with things like South Africa's carbon tax, and national carbon pricing policies, adaptation and climate finance, adaptation and macro financial risk, current account deficits and spillover risks. And whilst the IMF might not have the capabilities to deal with these in any extreme detail, it may want to start looking at these at an early stage. Government can also play an important role, particularly Treasury, in pulling together other departments in its engagements with the IMF and other IFIs. And same for civil society. Civil society could potentially advise government how and in what areas the IMF could be engaged on, and what this looks like, particularly in the context of the just transition. So that is a very potted summary from me. But now to the interesting conversation with Danny.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, so I mean, I've very briefly introduced our panelists when we started with the session, but for now, I'm going to hand over to Danny to take it from here, and I will come in again around 4:10, so we can move on to the Q&A session.
Great. Well, excuse me. Thank you, Alex. And good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, everyone in South Africa. I'm in Boston at the moment. Firstly, I want to congratulate Elizabeth and Olivia on a really useful report that should stimulate a discussion in South Africa on this very important topic of what role the IFIs in general and the IMF in particular can play in South Africa's transition to deal with climate change in a just and effective way. And it's particularly timely to do this because the climate, as Max and others have said today, is a macro critical issue. And the IMF therefore has to deal with it. It doesn't have a choice, but that it's pushing the IMF also to deal with environmental and social issues in a much more intensive way and a much more politically complex way than it has historically dealt with these sorts of issues. And this is forcing changes in the relationship the IMF has with its member states. And South Africa, if it wants to manage its relationship with the IMF effectively, is going to have to think through what role does it want the IMF to play as a consumer of the services of the IMF? So how does it use those services? But also as a stakeholder with a voice in the affairs of the IMF and a voice in the management of the policies and strategies of the IMF. And so it's a particularly useful report and should stimulate this debate, we hope. And I think today we have the perfect panel to do that. Alex has already introduced the panelists, so I'm just going to invite them each to speak in the order that they're listed in the program, which means first Leanne, then Sargon, and then Michael. So Leanne Govinswamy, I invite you to speak.
Thank you, Danny, and hello, everyone. I must reiterate what Danny has already said, to say really well done to Sai and Oxfam and all those who supported this work, which has led to this very timely paper. This is quite a much needed resource for civil society as we navigate and oversee the facilitation of climate financing in really uncharted territory. And I think this is being done on quite an urgent basis. It requires innovative, bold, but informed and co-created solutions. So I think the report will be incredibly useful since it's based on the premise that CSOs will be able to actively engage with its contents. And I think it's drafted in that way as well. As Marianne and Olivia have already mentioned, the launch of the Fair Finance Coalition in South Africa illustrates the willingness of civil society to not only bring together various bits of expertise from legal to policy expertise and campaigning expertise together, but to be able to understand DFIs and IFIs more closely, and this report definitely enables us to do so. We are working, the Fair Finance Coalition works together with the long-established Life After Coal campaign. So this really presents a unique opportunity for CSOs with quite diverse expertise to not only engage with DFIs and IFIs and who they are, what they do, or what will be their role in the climate finance deal or other deals, but will importantly be able to ensure that community voices are channeled into any consultative objective processes. And I think that's really important to bear in mind because of the access that many of these CSO coalitions offer. So I have about 4 points or so that I'd like to make in respect of the report, its findings and recommendations. I think the first relates to what others have already referred to, which is the criticisms which emerge from the report in terms of civil society actors being quite skeptical about the role of the IMF. On page 45 of the report, the Life After Coal campaign is referred to as saying that any IMF advice will be detrimental to such an agenda because of its history of setting a conservative, anti-poor macroeconomic approach. And in some of the interviews that were carried out for purposes of this report, some have said the IMF has no place to determine national climate change policy. And I think that these kinds of criticisms really need to be taken on board if there is to be meaningful engagement with civil society, as well as allowing for robust discussion in respect of these issues. But I also think that the global context may allow for a different approach to be co-created as multiple interests collide to address climate change. So this being not just a macro critical factor for purposes of IMF policy and approach, but this really speaks to a global need where people have recognized what needs to be done, have already found solutions and are advocating actively for those solutions, and where they could be part of the discussion. I mean, yesterday, the UN Secretary General referred to the recent report of the IPCC as an atlas of suffering, an indictment of failed climate leadership. Together with the fact that Africa is warming at twice the global average, these ongoing warnings and calls for decisive action, I think, create space for actors with multiple and differentiated interests and approaches to find common ground, common solutions, and we certainly hope that this will be the case. This may require the IMF to revise its approach to consultation and engagement and work on solutions together with local actors. But it is also very clear from those who were consulted for purposes of this report that many civil society and academic actors already have a great deal to add in terms of any approach that is being designed. I want to move on to very quickly our national context, and Olivia has referred to this already, where so much has already been done since 2010. And right now we have the Just Transition Framework from the Presidential Climate Change Commission out for comment. Our integrated resource plan, so our national energy plan, is going to be revised in coming months. We have the big $8.5 billion climate finance deal that is being negotiated. The climate change bill has been introduced into Parliament, and there are various other steps being taken by National Treasury on green taxonomies and the like. So I think it's important for there to be a recognition and an incorporation of work that is already being done in any kind of policy assessment of South Africa. And others have said this already, right? There has to be a recognition of local context. I think what I do want to post into the chat is what the National Climate Change Commission has said about the definition of a just transition. And I think that gives quite a good context to understand what type of financing is required, right? And what the purpose of that financing should be in order to realize those objectives. And I think it's important to then also recognize and draw from the lessons that we're learning as we go along in overseeing the climate finance deal. So you've heard various government actors, including Minister Godhan, for example, refer to this climate finance deal as just an offer, something that South Africa will decide on based on the terms and conditions that are attached to it. Recently, he has said, the reality is that you will get a few minor donations and the rest of the stuff, is speaking quite colloquially at a conference, is going to cost you money. which is the case in terms of where South Africa is concerned. And we need to think quite critically about these offers and deals that are being made and what South Africa's response to it is going to be. So, you know, ultimately, any plan needs to be aligned to South Africa's fiscal stance in terms of affordability and sustainability. And I also want to mention in terms of local context that the role that civil society has played in challenging traditional narratives of development is also incredibly important. If you look, for example, at what civil society has done in challenging gas developments, this is on challenging them legally and through campaigns. These developments may be regarded by private and government actors, international actors, as being important for growing the economy, but communities having had the coal experience are saying no to these developments and want to set their own standards for development and determine their own narrative. And are challenging gas developments on social, cultural, and environmental grounds. And I think that's really important to bear in mind, because in as much as we may want to focus on macroeconomic performance and what that means, you can see that on the ground and based on what is happening in South Africa, this may be fiercely contested. I know I have very limited time and I have two more points to make. The second last being around matching South Africa's finance needs and considerations to the intentions of the IMF. So recognizing that the just transition definition, for example, you know, what I've posted in the chat, there are many elements to the just transition, right? Some of the elements are aimed at rehabilitation of coal mines, reskilling of workers, addressing the health and social impacts of coal. And that will require very highly concessional grant funding, because the use of those funds is not to realize financial value, but to advance important social value. So I think there has to be a very careful consideration of what elements of the just transition is capable of being financed by international actors, or what elements they would like to finance in that context, given the different objectives that are being that one would have in respect of the just transition. And lastly, I think it is so important to recognize that CSOs are capacitated and willing to engage on these issues. And I've said this already, but I thought it was really important to emphasize, because oftentimes the justification for lack of consultation is, well, this is highly technical content, so we don't really need to engage with such a wide array or diverse, a wide range of actors. But I think as this report shows, and as actors themselves have shown, there is willingness, there is capacity, there is also technical expertise and experience that can come to bear on any kind of financial, any role that finance has to play in the just transition. And I think that's incredibly important to bear in mind. I think I will stop there, and I look forward to the discussions of this panel. And again, really well done to Sia and Oxfam.
Great, thanks, Leanne. And you were perfect. You were exactly on 10 minutes. So that was perfect timing. Sargon, let me hand over to you.
Thank you very much. And let me extend also my thanks to the panelists and the authors in Oxfam and SI for their excellent work. And I've been involved in this from the start and really agree with the points made both by Leanne and Danny regarding its value to this debate. I've already been introduced, so I just want to explain that I'll focus my remarks really on these dimensions of the IMF and climate, and I'm fascinated and listening carefully to you all colleagues in South Africa. So the reflections I have really on the role of the IMF in climate, and I think the report does a good job in documenting its trajectory and engaging with what it terms this macro-critical topic, really has come to the point where we've moved from sort of easy to frame rhetoric to tangible decisions and trade-offs. And I think this is where the IMF and this report really neatly illustrates it. faces a sort of Gordian knot, a really core dilemma. And it's not only facing it in South Africa, to do with essentially something that is its core job, I would argue, which is to help countries determine and navigate such trade-offs that Leanne, you just, I think, really articulately explained. And I don't think the IMF has historically been very honest about this, at least in its public engagement. And Danny, having been inside some of these private meetings on South Africa's behalf, maybe you can shed light on how those dialogues actually go. The issues that I particularly picked up on as being really quite evident in other countries, in particular in the global South, and similarly to South Africa, significant economies and regionally important states, I'm thinking of somewhere like Pakistan, are several. One issue is ESCOM, or particularly state-owned enterprises, and the trade-offs that pertain when sectors, entire industries in some cases, face questions of solvency and sustainability under their current capitalization and pricing. And I think this is a sort of area that this term macrocritical actually helpfully shows is really something the IMF should be doing. And I'm going to come back to this point repeatedly because I've decided to respond a little bit to the challenge that Leanne, you just posed as well, but I'll come to that in a moment. And I want to just highlight some of these roles the IMF should be playing, and which the report usefully highlights it is in some cases beginning to play. But I do think that lots of the IMF's engagement on these issues with its members is still marked by pretty significant inconsistency. And that can't entirely be attributed, I think, to the relative novelty, the fact that the IMF is new to this area and still is building expertise and capacity. Recent budget decisions should indicate a pretty large sea change, but they're starting from a pretty small base. But regardless, I think that the IMF is still working through what it means not to have a default setting of fiscal consolidation, of policy choices where fiscal targets in relatively short timeframes or durations are the first amongst equals of the policy buffet that policymakers inevitably have to make choices and decisions between. And I don't think the IMF has a playbook. There has been some developments in the multilateral surveillance outputs, meaning World Economic Outlook since 2020, and much more refined work on aspects of transition risks and fiscal policy. But I think when the rubber hits the road, and it's particularly evident in countries where the IMF is lending under especially traditional instruments like standby arrangements, the lack of this playbook is really evident. And I was really interested to read about the particular social engagement process that occurred in South Africa regarding developing a national and domestically derived idea of the just transition. And I think this really points to something that is the first part of the challenge that you set, Leanne, to the IMF's need to really evolve the way it works. Because I think that such an example is the only really route forward to articulate what just transition will mean, because I can't imagine that in any country it'll be identical to its neighbor or any other. It's going to have to reflect domestic priorities and needs. And I think the IMF has tended to acknowledge that when it talks of country ownership, but it needs to have a much finer understanding of what that means when it comes to policy advice, conditions, and prior actions in lending in the latter two cases. And I think, as you helpfully mentioned, Elizabeth, that in our work and others from our peers and community, we've still found that IMF advice is often quite incompatible with countries' own nationally determined contributions to meet the Paris goal, Paris alignment, or in terms of basically leaving fossil fuels in the ground. Now, I appreciate, and I've spoken to a few of you in the past and learned quite how acute the challenge is in South Africa, given the export of fossil fuels, the sectors, they're highly concentrated, the nature of the employment base in there. And of course, I agree, are right to highlight social protection and related factors is really critical to how that transition could play out. Having worked also on the IMF's efforts to articulate its own idea of responsibility and role vis-a-vis social protection, it leaves me quite concerned. The IMF has often devolved or defaulted to targeted compensatory payments when there's been significant transitions. It's very suspicious of the otherwise widely accepted definition of social protection. So I think that probably suggests that some of the recommendations in the report, such as partnerships with agencies like the ILO or indeed the World Bank, are somewhat optimistic given the track record of the IMF. And the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF has actually talked about this in relatively recent reports. So can we rely on recommendations like those? I would return back to the points Leanne made about the importance of the consultation process. And I'm delighted to see Max Allier, forgive me if I've mispronounced your name, the resident representative on this call, because I'd like to sort of really emphasize quite how important I believe the evolution of the IMF's engagement with civil society has been. But it's been very, very inconsistent and relied heavily where it's been most successful and able to meet, without repeating what you said, Leanne, some of the objectives and ambitions you set out for civil society engagement. Resident representatives are fundamental. And unfortunately, we've had to rely all too often on the personal engagement and enlightened approach of an individual resident representative, because the IMF lacks a culture and indeed anything like sufficient policy or guidance notes about how it would broaden the stakeholder base with which it engages. Because I think one of the critical lessons from this report is that the IMF will not be an effective partner on climate unless it learns to engage with a much broader community of actors. And I think practically that means a resident representative has a big role to play. But I think it's important that we demand the IMF systematize, make itself much more open and systematize its engagement with broader stakeholder base. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Sargon. Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I think it's useful maybe to frame the way Danny did the conversation. I mean, I think there are two issues here that kind of we need to disentangle. The one is South Africa's role as a stakeholder in the IMF. So we are a member of the G20. We're significant in the global kind of economy. We've played a leading role over many years in discussions about IMF reform and the like. And that is important. And of course, the IMF needs to constantly be, we need to constantly face the struggle of the fact that the IMF remains a Western-dominated, Washington-based institution that has been unable to reform itself. And this, of course, is not the fault necessarily of the IMF staff. But you know, the US retains a veto on the IMF board and all of that. And I think South Africa has managed to play a very progressive role in those debates about IMF reform. And I'm sure when it comes to climate change, we will continue to play a leading role in that. The second set of issues is, as Danny puts it, as a user of IMF services. And here it's important to remember the context, which is that not only the IMF, but the Washington-based institutions are not significant players in the South African policy debate, have never been significant players in the South African policy debate, and I expect them not to be in the future. And there are two reasons for this, in my view. The first is kind of ideological and about the very strongly entrenched kind of antipathy towards the Washington-based institutions that emerged out of the structural adjustment programs in Africa, and as the ANC was kind of thinking about the future in the 80s, this is when those things were going. So the ANC entered government with a very strong antipathy towards the IMF. But I actually think that's a secondary question. The primary reason why the IMF has not been a significant player in South African policy debates is that we don't need the IMF. We have no dependence on the IMF. We are a market access country. And what that means is that we are able to fund ourselves by issuing bonds. And we've never had to call in the IMF or the World Bank to fund us. So last year, there was or recently in the last few weeks, there was a lot of discussion about a World Bank loan. I know the IMF loan that we got last year was a bit more, but this World Bank loan was something like $700 million. And you know, that's the volume of debt that our Treasury issues every week. On private markets. So our relationship of debt is in the first instance with private markets. And there's no reason really for us to borrow from international organizations in order to fund ourselves. Now, there are this may change. And it may change because we can see climate change as a very large external shock. So South Africa has the most carbon intensive economy in the world. And you know, people usually look to kind of emissions as per capita. But if you look at emissions per unit of GDP, in almost every sector, we're in the top 5. So so for example, so this isn't only about coal exports. Our manufacturing exports are the most carbon intensive manufacturing exports in the world. And in order to correct that problem, we will be facing in the next few years the writing off of a very large share of our capital stock and a need to invest huge resources to not add to the capital stock, but simply to replace the existing capital stock. So once we've conducted all of this investment, we will end up with a capital stock that generates electricity from different sources, but it's still just electricity. We wouldn't have fundamentally changed the product. So how do we finance this very large investment effort that will be required if we are to engage in this transformation? And there are two ways you can finance a large investment effort of that nature on a sustainable basis. You can either constrain domestic consumption, or you can finance it externally. Now, constraining domestic consumption is difficult. There are two important elements of it in South Africa. The first is public consumption, which we've been talking about a lot recently, because we are in a fiscal crisis. And part of the way we're going to have to navigate out of that fiscal crisis is by constraining government consumption or public consumption. But the other big element of high levels of consumption in South Africa is the consumption of the top 10% of most affluent households in South Africa, who consume and emit carbon at a rate that is equivalent to the richest people in developed economies. So now the primary question that we will have to answer as we engage in this just transition is domestic. It's about whether we can find each other on the balance of how much can we restrain domestic consumption, how much can we bring the unions. And I mean, I should say that when we talk about CSOs, we must remember that the big debates, the big policy debates that are taking place in South Africa are going to take place essentially between a democratically elected government and trade unions, in which CSOs will play hopefully a supportive role and need to help us to engage the problem that is now emerged in the standoff between the union movement, particularly in the mining sector, and the state on the just transition. So if we can resolve those domestic contradictions, or let me put it like this, the more that we can access foreign financing to finance our investment in this just transition, the more it will ease the pressure on the domestic contradictions. And of course, we don't have, as I said, trouble accessing foreign financing from bond markets, but the IMF becomes a partner in that process, and I think maybe a very important partner. So I think I will stop there and just say, you know, the most important contribution that the IMF can make to the just transition in South Africa is to continue producing high quality, rigorous annual assessments of our macroeconomic position that can help, which they do every year in the form of the Article 4 papers, that can help government engage in the discussions, and really anything that detracts from that role, I think would be a loss for South Africa. However we are, because I think there's a sense here that we should avoid trying to convert the IMF into a World Bank. In other words, into a very large kind of CSO operating at the global scale, not being really sure what its function and role is. The IMF's function and role is to deal with external imbalances and to surveil macroeconomic policy. And I think they should be encouraged to do that with the same clear mandate that they have done up to now. Let me stop there.
Great, thank you, Michael. I think we've had three very thought-provoking and challenging presentations. I know we're supposed to have time for questions now. And I also know we're running over time a bit, so I'm going to defer to Alex and Elizabeth in deciding how much questions we can take. Also, I can't see who's asking questions, so if you can invite people to ask questions, we can take it from there. Alex?
Well, I think let's do what we can, but obviously we need to stop with a Q&A at 25 past so that there is 5 minutes left for closing remarks. Okay. Questions, I think, can either be posed in the chat. I see we do have one question in the Q&A function, or you can raise a hand. I haven't read this question yet, so I'm just going to kind of read it out loud as we go. Max talks of private sector being important in the climate change discourse. How important as they are polluters? Is it in the agenda of the IMF to include and engage civil society groups in this respect? Is the IMF amenable to discussions and engagements with civil society like Oxfam and others? In the language of the IMF, what is just transition and the green economy? Okay.
Max, I think that's for you.
Yeah, well, I think it is for me. Yeah. Very good. Well, first of all, yeah, I mean, we need to engage. I was referring in my remarks specifically to the part of financing the transition. Requires such a large amount of resources everywhere. In South Africa, also, you know, there are these big estimates in South Africa, like 2 trillion rand kind of estimates to achieve the transition. Well, there's no public money or even international money that will fill that gap. So you really need to work with creating conditions for the private sector to also participate in financing all this transition. So this is essential, it's basic. You need to find the resources. How important are they as polluters? Yes, I think that's somewhat a little bit less, a little bit further away from the IMF mandate in particular, but obviously there are the emission caps, then the carbon taxes, that's closer to what we do, because we need, I mean, obviously the climate change, if the emitters do not reduce emissions, it's not gonna happen, obviously. So, you know, we can help on the more economic, you know, like carbon tax kind of analysis kind of thing, but there are other institutions obviously will have much better grasp of those particular issues. In terms of engagement with civil society, well, I certainly can speak for myself in South Africa, but I mean, I'm just a small piece into the whole big organization. But I think my colleagues in Washington and Oxfam is certainly in touch with them all the time on a regular basis. Is the dialogue perfect? No, probably not, but nothing is perfect in life. But I think we have come a very long way from where we were a few years back. And, you know, I've been perhaps for too long at the IMF. And I'll tell you, remember when I joined the IMF, you know, 25 years ago, it was funny. I think basically our external relations department mission was to avoid questions from the press. Today, we publish all our reports, everything is there. We have regular press briefings. So it's a whole different changing culture in openness and dialogue. And I think some of the criticism that is about the IMF is very valid. But I think sometimes of this criticism fails to recognize the change and the evolution over the last decade, certainly, let alone 2 decades. You know, I think many things need to be changed, they need to be improved. Very important to recognize that we have been moving on that front. Now, on the language of just transition and green economy, obviously on just transition, like in all these economic policies and economic reforms, there are winners and there are losers. And obviously you want to, into the losers, which usually are, you know, in the case of South Africa, will be the miners, the coal miners, there will be the regions where the mines take place or the current energy is produced. All these people will be affected. And I get that just transition is obviously to mitigate the impact, but how it is done depends on the different groups. I mean, you say taking a 25-year-old person, where you want to retool and retrain this person who probably, hopefully can join the new kind of energy production on retool. You find someone who is, I don't know, 55, 60 years old, who spent all his life in a mine, probably did not have a very good education because of his generation. Will this person, you cannot retool. Maybe you just need to retire this person and give them a pension. So you need to tool this just transition to take those things. And in terms of the green economy, I think they're obviously important. We're not the leading institution on this, but there are clear scientific parameters on the levels of emissions that need to be achieved and the targets that need to be set. And that's what a green economy is one that will bring our emissions collectively and individually to levels that are sustainable and will avoid kind of the catastrophe that are predicted if the global temperature, say, raises by 2 degrees, 3 degrees, or all these projections. But I mean, obviously, this is a scientific thing where we will need to borrow the concept from elsewhere. Those are the answers to those things. But given the limitation of time, I don't want to monopolize. I have some other comments, but let's leave others to make up other questions. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Alex, are there any more questions?
I believe Sargon wanted to make a few final remarks.
I mean, I'd be happy to. I do have a few more, but I didn't make a special request to do so, certainly. I don't want to step in front of the queue. But you let me know, Danny.
I don't see other hands. I think if you do want to make a few remarks, we've just got literally a couple of minutes left before I want to hand over to Nadia.
I'll take 30 seconds. I'll take 30 seconds in that case. I think the report's proposals do imply a reversal or transformation of IMF, not just default policy, but the relationship between it and its members. And that means evolving from a gatekeeper, even if a country does have market access, as Michael set out, to one that helps define financing need. And this has profound implications, but we need to harness the credibility of the IMF, not to strangle investment, but to actually help define these huge numbers. The report, I think the number you set out for the just transition cost estimates was almost identical to the national debt of South Africa, if I read that correctly. So I do think there's a political economy challenge. The IMF is basically a political entity sat atop a technocratic institution that pretends the political economy isn't there. But as you just said, Max, regarding who will lose out from transition, the IMF needs to learn to be honest about that in a way it hasn't in the past. And that may actually make for a challenging transformation in its relationship to members, especially ones that are amongst the 20 biggest emitters in the world, as South Africa is.
Can I just make one comment, Alex, just before the last question, which I can see here, which is, to go back to something Michael said, but it builds on what Sargon said, is that when people talk about what the IMF is and what it does, I think you have to be very skeptical of that. There is no, thinking aloud, there's no international financial institution that's evolved as dramatically from its origins as the IMF has. It was set up to deal with a system of flexible but relatively fixed exchange rates, to one that dealt with debt issues, that dealt with political transitions in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union, so that it keeps evolving. It's got a mandate set out in its articles that is very broad and open to very different interpretations. And that what climate is doing really is forcing it to rethink what its role in the world is and how it needs to change. And that, I think, is part of the challenge for us. And while I totally agree with Michael that the Article 4 reports play an important role in the sense of providing thought, analysis and information to South Africa, that role is going to change as the IMF gets more involved in climate change. And it's up to South Africa to think through, how do we make that role serve our needs as effectively as possible? And this report is part of building that process. And just the last question, if we have 30 seconds to deal with that, Alex, and I'll defer to you on this. Or do we need to move to closings?
I think we need to move to closing. We're already beyond the final 5 minutes.
Okay. So Stephen Karakezi, my apologies, but Alex, I'll hand back to you.
Yes, apologies from me too. I'm sure we could keep this discussion going all afternoon, but just to keep to the program, I want to hand over now for a final few words to Nadia Dar, who's at the Washington, D.C. office of Oxfam International.
Thank you all, and thank you all for participating in this wonderful event. Thank you, Saya, for this fantastic work. Honestly, Elizabeth and Olivia, you've done such a wonderful and impressive job here, and I especially want to say how much I valued the process of how you worked on this paper, including the feedback workshops and just making it really feel like it was a dialogue with partners, not just with Oxfam, of course, but with many of those who are in the room today, and including with the IMF. Max, thank you for being here. I wanted to just go back to remembering why Oxfam commissioned this paper. We were initially planning a report, to be honest, that was much broader. I'm sitting here in DC working at the headquarters level, and as the IMF was increasing its attention to climate change issues, to energy issues, as it was increasing its capacity at quite a rapid pace, we wanted to be able to be in a position to critique that in a constructive way, and also to be able to think, what would that ideal role look like if we were designing it? We felt it was important to understand that, but also to project what it would look like in the ideal scenario. And what we quickly realized was that without this being grounded in what a just transition would look like in key high emitting countries where the IMF is actually going to be focusing its attention, so that it's noted that it's going to be focusing its efforts in the top 20 high emitting countries, we thought it would just remain a theoretical project and that it really needed to be grounded. And given how much amazing work has been done on challenging coal, on promoting a just transition from so many different angles, from amazing civil society groups in South Africa, and also with the heavily debated but widely discussed role for the IMF in South Africa, some of which we got snippets of today, it was clearly a really important place for us to ground the way people were seeing what a just transition in South Africa could look like, or should look like, and what role the IMF could play. So I'm just so thrilled with how this project has evolved. And I do see it as an evolution, and I know so many of you do too, and this is just the start. So I hope this is really the beginning, and that these debates and discussions continue with South African civil society continuing to monitor what's happening closely on the ground in terms of what's happening with the IMF in your country. And this Fair Finance initiative that Marianne mentioned is very exciting. There are new things coming up. Of course, there is the Article 4 to look at and see what is, I think it's coming out soon if it hasn't already, forgive me on that. But there's also, as Olivia was mentioning, there's the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which is just about to be approved at the board by the IMF in the global sense, and it will be an interesting piece to keep an eye on. So the IMF surveillance work is important, but whatever the position on the IMF, I think Danny's remark on how do we make sure that whatever that role is, that it's serving the needs of what South Africans want is a really good way of looking at it. I hope the engagement and openness from the IMF continues. And Max, to your point, yes, we're very much in touch with the headquarters and so many of your colleagues here. But as Sargon mentioned, the engagement is really in different countries left up to many individual people. And so thank you for your openness. And there has been improvement in many countries, of course, but I hope that will just continue to grow and be meaningful, bringing in a wide range of stakeholders, especially as the IMF is getting involved in these different areas. And there are tensions to unpack. It's not just about the traditional, sort of people working on fiscal justice, for example, but it's also so important, of course, to be bringing in unions and women's rights organizations and climate justice organizations as the IMF is moving into these new areas. And so I hope that engagement will continue at the national level. I hope that this report will be useful for your colleagues at the global level as they think about their strategy on engaging in climate more broadly. And I look forward to future discussions. Thank you all so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We've kept very nicely to time. And I think with that, we can say our goodbyes. The link is in the chat to the report, but it's also easy to track down on SAIA's website. Thank you again. Elizabeth?
One thing, Alex, I've also posted the IMF report, which and the landing page, which includes both their reports on climate change in South Africa as well as the staff note. I think, Max, is that correct? I think the landing page has links to various reports.
Yes, I want to bring to your attention, we published recently the Article 4 report. You can find that you have the selected issues paper where we have a piece on structural reforms and climate change. And there is this link that you send to a country focus where we have basically, it's like a summary of that paper. But you have there all the links to the reports. And as I said, please contact me, anyone who wants to discuss the report, have an exchange of views on them. I would be happy to do that.
Excellent, thank you. And I think, Elizabeth, you're happy. Shall we close? Very good. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.